biology peoples. Today we're going to be talking about genetics pedigrees. So before we begin talking about genetics pedigrees, we need to do a quick review of genotypes, phenotypes, and what it means to be dominant or recessive. Characteristics of a dominant allele is that we only need one copy to show a trait. In order for recessive alleles to determine the phenotype or traits observed in the individual, we need two copies. All right, let's go back to our genetics pedigree worksheet. All right, in question number 1, it says, use the below pedigree chart to answer the following questions about dimples. The dimple gene controls whether a person has dimples or doesn't have dimples. Dimples is dominant to no dimples. So dimples, if we have a big D, capital letter D here, that would be for dimples. Mark. Let's look at individuals 3 and 4. 3 and 4 are not afflicted with the trait, but they have a child number 10, that is. So how is it that two individuals can give rise to an offspring that has a different trait? Well, let's go back to those Punnett squares. Let's draw up a Punnett square for a scenario. We'll call this scenario number 1. In scenario number 1, both individuals are homozygous recessive, meaning they have two lowercase d alleles. During segregation in meiosis, each of mom's eggs will therefore contain a little d allele, carrying that recessive trait. If the dad has also two little d alleles, during segregation, each of his sperm will contain a little d allele. The first possible offspring, the second, the third, and the fourth. All 4 offspring are genetically identical to their parents. If individuals 3 and 4 were homozygous recessive, they could not give rise to this individual with a different trait. If they were both homozygous recessive, all of their offspring would be identical. And since they aren't, we know that the genotype of individuals 3 and 4 cannot be homozygous recessive. All right, during segregation, each of mom's eggs will contain the large D allele here, if they're homozygous dominant, and same for dad. During segregation, all of his sperm would contain a large uppercase D corresponding to a dominant trait. Let's take a look at what the 4 offspring would look like. Is scenario 2 possible? Well, no. If scenario 2 was the case, individual number 10 here would be identical to mom and dad, but they're not identical. They're different. Let's look at a third scenario. What if individuals 3 and 4 are homozygous dominant and heterozygous? Now, in this case, if mom or dad was heterozygous and we switch them, it won't matter. We'll get the same probability. So let's take a look at that Punnett square. If one of the parents is heterozygous and the other parent is homozygous dominant, the end result is that 100% of the offspring have that dominant trait. So all offsprings are identical to the mom and the dad. Again, scenario number 3 doesn't work because individual number 10, their female child, has a different trait than them. If we take a look at our pedigree, we notice that there's a 1 in 4 chance, if both parents are heterozygous, that they give rise to an offspring that has a different phenotype than either parent. And that's what we're seeing here. Individuals 3 and 4, which both must have a dominant allele. We have individual 10, which shows a homozygous recessive trait, a trait that is only possible if one of those smaller d's came from the dad and the other smaller d came from the mom. So let's apply this logic, therefore, to some of the other individuals. We look at female number 8 and male number 9. They both have the same phenotype, but they give rise to two offspring, 12 and number 14 here, that both have a different trait. Well, there's only one possible scenario in which two parents can give rise to an offspring that has a different trait than either of them. And that's when both of the parents are heterozygous. So one thing we know is that individual number 8 has a dominant allele, individual number 9 has a dominant allele. We know that individuals numbers 12 and 14 are both heterozygous recessive. That's why they have the different trait than their parents. And the only way that those individuals could be homozygous recessive is if they inherited a recessive allele from each parent. Now let's take a look at child number 13 here. Child number 13 has at least one big D allele. Now it's possible that they would have homozygous dominant or heterozygous. From this pedigree, we don't know the second allele. So this is unknown. We know that they have one dominant allele, but we don't know if they have two dominant alleles or if they're heterozygous. Let's take a look at individuals 1 and 2 now. One thing we've learned from the other parts of our pedigree is that the shaded in boxes correspond to homozygous recessive. So we know that this father, I guess the grandfather in this pedigree, is homozygous recessive. And we know that the mother here has at least one big D allele, but we're not sure about the second allele. Is it possible that each one of these offspring get a lowercase allele from their father? Not just possible, that's the only allele they could possibly inherit. So they all get a recessive allele from their father. Individuals 5, 6, 7, and 8, none of them are shaded boxes, which mean that they each must have a capital D allele from the mother. So we know the genotypes of individuals 5, 6, 7, and 8. What we don't know is individual number 2, because it's possible that the mom could be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. So if dad is homozygous recessive, let's do one more scenario. Second set of scenarios here. Let's call this scenario 1B. There you go. Let's say that dad is little d, and mom is homozygous dominant. If we look at the offsprings, 5, 6, 7, and 8, they're all big D, little d. So this is a highly likely scenario that the mom is homozygous dominant. The dad we know is homozygous recessive. What if the mom is heterozygous? In scenario number 2 here, there's a 50-50 chance that each offspring will be heterozygous, and there's a 50% chance that they will be homozygous recessive. Now, while it's less likely that 4 times in a row you would get a heterozygous offspring, it's not impossible. So we might suspect from having 4 children, none of which had no dimples, we might suspect that the mother has this genotype, but we can't exclude this for sure. We don't know. She could be heterozygous. It could just be one of those statistical probabilities that, while unlikely, it is still possible. So we don't know for sure what the second allele is for individual numbers 2. The last 2 individuals here, numbers 9 and 10. We know number 9 got a big D allele. That's why the box isn't shaded in. We know individual number 11 has a big D allele. That's why the box isn't shaded in. What we don't know from this scenario is, are they homozygous dominant Are they homozygous dominant? Are they heterozygous? We can't tell by looking. So for this individual, we don't know. But from this individual, we do know because they had offspring that contained 2 recessive alleles. So in this particular pedigree, where it says, how many family members have dimples? We know dimples is dominant. So that means that all of the shaded boxes are no dimples. All of the unshaded boxes are dimples. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we have 10 individuals with dimples. What is the genotype of individuals 3 and 4? Well, they're both heterozygous. Individual number C, can either individual number 8 or 9 be homozygous? If 8 or 9 were both homozygous dominant, individuals 12 and 14 would be impossible. Because remember, if both parents are homozygous dominant, there's 0% chance of having a no dimples child. If one parent is homozygous dominant, there's a 0% chance of having a child without dimples. And what we see here is that individuals 12 and 14 prove why individuals 8 and 9 cannot be homozygous. When we explain the relationship between individuals numbers 12 and number 2, we would say that number 12 and number 2, this child's mother's mother. So this would be on his mother's side. On his mother's side, we would say maternal. So on individual number 12, this grandchild, this grandson's mother's side, this is the grandmother. So the maternal grandmother. All right, I'll leave the rest for you to practice. Make sure that you're asking questions. Make sure you're thinking about Punnett squares and probability. Look at the relationships between each generation. Determine what their likely genotypes are. In some cases, it's obvious. In other cases, it might not be so obvious. In fact, you might not know from the information provided what their exact genotype is. And that's okay. Just put a question mark for the second allele if it's possible that they're heterozygous or homozygous dominant. Good luck. Give it a try. Enjoy. See you all next time.